So you're trying to get a handle on what's actually happening with U.S.-China trade.
Right.
It feels like one minute there's maybe some progress, the next it's a step back.
Absolutely. And lately, it's been especially confusing.
These conflicting headlines. Are they even talking?
Exactly. We've had claims coming out of the U.S. Administration that seem to just flatly contradict what China's saying.
Okay, so let's jump right in. President Trump mentioned a recent phone call with Xi Jinping, specifically about trade negotiations.
He did, and that sounds pretty significant, doesn't it?
Yeah, like a big step.
The implication was clearly that China was, reaching out, maybe interested in moving things forward.
But then China's response,
Okay.
pretty firm, right?
Oh, yeah. They said basically no such call happened.
That it didn't stop there.
No, because then Chinese state media put out this story suggesting the U.S. has actually been the one pushing for talks about tariffs.
It's like a completely flipped narrative.
Totally flipped. So the puzzle we're trying to unpack today is this. Who is actually reaching out to whom? And what does this whole back and forth tell us about where things stand?
Right.
To try and figure this out, we've been looking at recent reports, Newsweek, Fox News, places like that. Also used Wikipedia, just for a solid timeline background.
Good idea.
And then dug into some heavier analysis from the Tax Foundation and the Budget Lab at Yale to really understand the potential economic side of things.
So the mission here is clarity. Cut through the noise on these conflicting stories and see what it might mean.
That's the plan. Give you a clear picture.
Okay, so this core contradiction. U.S. says China called. China says, you called. Let's nail down the specifics here. Trump's claim first.
President Trump stated pretty clearly that Xi Jinping had called him recently to talk trade.
Painting China as the proactive one.
Exactly. Like they're keen to get back to the negotiating table.
And the official word from China, you mentioned the spokesperson.
Right. Guo Jiakun, the foreign ministry spokesperson, they explicitly denied any recent calls at all between the leaders about trade.
Not just the content, but the call itself.
Right. And also denied any ongoing talks specifically about tariffs, which, directly contradicts the U.S. version.
Then there's this other angle, the Chinese state media report, citing an economist, Tan Zhu. What was their take?
Well, that report claims the U.S. has been using, quote, various channels to try and propose talks specifically on the tariff issue.
Completely reversing it.
Completely. It paints the Trump administration as the eager party here, pushing for tariff talks, while China is sort of standing back, saying, Washington needs to show some meaningful action first.
Wow. It's such a stark contrast. U.S. says China wants a deal. China says the U.S. is desperate for talks.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. What are the internal political risks for Xi Jinping or any Chinese leader just being seen as the one initiating contact with Trump on trade right now?
That's a really critical point. There's analysis from Jin Sun at King's College London suggesting that for any Chinese leader to make that first move, well, it could have serious political blowback inside China.
How so?
Within the Chinese Communist Party's power structure, being seen as the one reaching out to Trump, especially on trade right now, could easily be framed by political rivals as well as weakness.
Okay. Undermining their position.
Potentially, yes. It could undermine their authority, make them look like they're caving. So the key takeaway from that analysis is initiating that call could be politically quite costly for Xi at home.
So him picking up the phone first, big internal risk.
That's the argument. Sure. So the economic relationship, it's deepened massively over decades, right? Especially after China started its market reforms back in the late 70s.
And then WTO entry was huge.
Absolutely pivotal. China joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, which the U.S. supported, by the way, that really turbocharged trade between the two. They became vital economic partners.
But this trade deficit issue, that's been a constant friction point for the U.S. side.
It really has. For a long, long time, the U.S. has imported way more from China than it exports to China. That created this big, persistent trade deficit. It peaked, I think, over $375 billion back in 2017.
Wow.
And part of that, comes down to fundamental differences, like savings rates in the two countries.
But U.S. concerns about trade with China aren't brand new, are they? This wasn't just a Trump administration thing initially.
Oh, definitely not. Even before the recent escalation, you had the Bush and Obama administrations raising flags, concerns about the trade imbalance, China's currency policies back then.
Right, I remember the currency manipulator accusations.
Exactly. And they did take some actions, quotas, tariffs on specific things like textiles, aluminum, steel, citing dumping, subsidies, things they argued were hurting U.S. industry.
But trade still grew overall during that time.
It did, yeah. Despite those specific actions, the overall volume just kept climbing.
And then China's economy just kept booming.
Undeniably, China's rise to become the world's second largest economy. That shifted everything. Plus, you had these ambitious global projects like the Belt and Road Initiative and their big push for tech leadership, Made in China 2025.
Which started raising concerns in the U.S. about its own economic and, well, geopolitical standing.
Exactly. That really set the stage for the more assertive approach we saw starting in the Trump administration's first term.
So what was the core argument then for bringing in the big tariffs?
President Trump's consistent message was that basically China's unfair trade practices were costing the U.S. economy hundreds of billions every year.
And intellectual property theft was a huge part of that claim.
A primary focus. His administration put estimates out there suggesting massive losses just from IP theft alone. The argument was this just wasn't sustainable.
I remember hearing phrases like previous administrations being naive.
Yeah, that was a view expressed, for instance, by former White House counsel Jim Schultz, that the U.S. had been too trusting, perhaps, regarding China's trade behavior.
And the tech transfer issue was particularly sharp.
Absolutely central. The U.S. alleged forced technology transfer, basically. American companies feeling pressured to hand over tech just to get market access in China.
Right.
Plus concerns about state-backed acquisitions of U.S. tech firms, cyber theft, all aimed at getting a technological edge. So the administration moved to block some deals, tried to stop those coercive practices.
And China's view on that?
Well, they consistently denied that forced IP transfer was official policy. They point to their own massive investments and progress in domestic R&D.
There was that comment from Larry Summers, too, wasn't there?
Yes, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary. He argued that China's tech success, at least in part, came from huge government investment in basic science, not just theft or forced transfer.
And China did bring in a new law eventually.
They did, in 2020. A foreign investment law that explicitly banned forced IP transfer and promised stronger protections for foreign IP. Kind of an attempt to address those specific complaints.
But the tariffs had already started by then. What were the first things hit back in 2018?
It started with solar panels and washing machines, actually. Then quickly moved to broader tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, not just from China, but globally, though China wasn't the biggest U.S. steel supplier.
Then it really broadened out.
Yeah, the administration invoked Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, claiming unfair practices, IP theft, and announced tariffs on a huge list of Chinese goods. Thousands of product categories.
And China hit back immediately.
Right away. Retaliatory tariffs on key American exports, aluminum, planes, cars, pork, and especially soybeans. Big hit for U.S. agriculture.
And initially, U.S. officials kind of downplayed the impact.
They did, but the tit for tat escalated really fast. Both sides kept announcing more tariffs, raising rates on existing ones, threatening even more throughout 2019.
It felt like pretty much everything was getting caught up in it.
It really did. The U.S. ramped up tariffs on goods already targeted, threatened to cover almost everything else coming from China. China retaliated again, even labeled the U.S. a currency manipulator for a bit.
Until the Phase 1 deal.
Right. Amidst all that tension, they reached the Phase 1 deal in December 2019.
Which was supposed to kind of cool things down.
That was the idea. It involved rolling back some tariffs, postponing others that were planned, but honestly, a lot of the details were pretty vague.
And the fundamental issues weren't really solved.
Not really, no. The core disagreements that started the whole thing, they were mostly still there.
Okay, fast forward. Biden administration takes over. Did they reverse course on Trump's tariffs?
Interestingly, no, not broadly. The Biden administration kept many of those Trump-era tariffs in place. Yeah. But they also added their own layer of restrictions, new export controls, investment bans targeting specific Chinese companies.
Why? What was the justification?
The stated goal was protecting U.S. economic and national security interests, especially in high-tech sectors. Think Huawei, chip makers like NVIDIA and YMTC, drone companies like DJI, even genomics firms like BGI.
Okay, so that brings us pretty much up to date. 2025, President Trump back in office, and the tariff situation, it seems like it's escalated again significantly.
It really has. Almost immediately after returning in January 2025, there was an executive order basically directing government agencies to review trade practices and come up with recommendations for more tariffs.
Setting the stage.
Exactly. And things moved quickly after that.
Can you walk us through some of the main tariff actions we've seen just this year in 2025?
Sure. First, we saw the IEPA border security and fentanyl tariffs. That started in February with a 10% tariff on everything coming from China.
Everything.
Pretty much all imports. And that jumped to 20% in March. Similar tariffs hit Canada and Mexico too, though there was some back and forth suspensions, and then exemptions for things like cars and goods under the USMCA trade deal.
Well,
those exemptions were eventually made indefinite.
And IEPA. That stands for?
International Emergency Economic Powers Act gives the president pretty broad power to regulate commerce in a national emergency. And USMCA, that's the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the NAFTA replacement.
Got it. Then there was the universal tariff announcement. That sounded huge.
It was announced April 2nd, a baseline minimum 10% tariff on goods from basically every country except Canada and Mexico.
A global tariff, almost.
With the potential for even higher rates, maybe up to 50%, depending on the trade balance with specific countries, a major shift towards protectionism.
And then China got hit again, specifically.
Yeah, just days later, early April. Another 50% tariff specifically on Chinese goods.
On top of the 20% IEPA ones.
Exactly, bringing the total rate on most Chinese imports up to, well, a massive 145%.
145%. This is extraordinary.
It is. There was a temporary 90-day pause announced for reciprocal tariffs from other countries, but not for China.
Any relief?
Exemptions. Some exemptions were announced later in April for certain electronics, but we also saw specific sectors targeted. Semiconductors and pharmaceuticals mentioned with rates of 25% and higher. Steel and aluminum tariffs were increased, exemptions removed, scope widened.
Autos, too.
Autos got a 25% tariff effective April 3rd, though with some content exemptions for Canada and Mexico, plus new investigations into copper and lumber, tariffs on agriculture from outside North America. Even Venezuelan oil got hit with an extra 25%.
And the EU wasn't spared either.
Nope. A 25% tariff was announced for the EU back in February, later clarified as a 20% reciprocal rate in April. It's been a very active few months on the tariff front.
Understatement. These are not small adjustments.
Yeah.
So what are the projected economic impacts? This must be where the Tax Foundation and Yale Budget Lab analyses come in.
Exactly. They've tried to quantify what this all means. The Tax Foundation, for instance, estimates that just statically, without behavior changes, the average effective tariff rate on all U.S. imports would shoot up to 18%.
Highest since
1943. Now, they do account for imports dropping significantly because of the tariffs. They estimate maybe an $800 billion or 23% fall. Even then, they project the average effective rate lands at 11.3%, still very high historically.
That points to a big hit to trade flows.
It does, and Yale's Budget Lab did a really detailed breakdown, focusing on the 2025 tariffs up to that April 2nd announcement.
What do they find?
Well, just that April 2nd action alone, they reckon, is like an 11.5 percentage point hike in the effective U.S. tariff rate.
And the consequence for people's wallets?
They project a 1.3% increase in the overall price level in the short run. That translates to about a $2,100 loss for the average household using $2024.
Ouch. And for the broader economy?
Yeah.
GDP?
They forecast it shaves about half a percentage point off real GDP growth in 2025. And long-term, a 0.4% smaller GDP, which is like $100 billion a year lost, again in 2024 terms.
So higher prices, slower growth, just from the April tariffs.
According to their model, yes. Significant costs for households and a drag on the economy.
And that was just part of the picture. What happens when you factor in all the 2025 tariffs announced?
Right. When the Budget Lab looked at the whole package, including likely retaliation, the projected impact gets bigger. They estimate almost a 20 percentage point jump in the effective tariff rate.
And prices. Household costs.
A 2.3% short-term price level increase. That works out to an average household loss of around $3,800 a year.
$3,800.
In GDP, almost a full percentage point lower growth predicted for 2025 0.9 TP reduction. And a 0.6% smaller economy in the long run, about $160 billion annually.
Are certain goods hit harder than others?
Definitely. They specifically called out clothing and textiles, projecting a huge 17% price jump under the full tariff scenario.
Wow. So consumers definitely feel this. What about government revenue? Do tariffs at least bring in money? And who bears the brunt?
Well, the Budget Lab looked at that too. The April 2nd tariffs alone might raise $1.4 trillion over 10 years. On paper, that's conventional scoring. But, yeah, when you factor in the negative hit to the economy, what they call dynamic scoring, that revenue gain shrinks by $366 billion.
So the economic drag eats into the revenue.
Significantly. And for all the 2025 tariffs combined, the conventional estimate is $3.1 trillion in revenue, but the dynamic score shows $582 billion less revenue gain because of the economic damage.
And importantly, who pays?
Tariffs are generally seen as regressive. They hit lower-income households harder because things like clothing, food, basic goods make up a bigger chunk of their spending. So a price increase on those items hurts them disproportionately.
And the ripple effects go beyond the U.S.
Right.
What about globally?
Yeah, their analysis touched on that. Canada is projected to take a significant hit from all these tariffs. Mexico, interestingly, might see a slightly larger economy long-term.
And China?
China's economy projected slightly smaller. The UK and EU might actually see a very small positive impact, perhaps due to trade diversion.
It's helpful to compare this to what actually happened with the last round of major tariffs during Trump's first term. What did the Tax Foundation find when they looked back?
Their retrospective analysis was really telling. They pointed out, for example, that there are way more jobs in industries that use steel than in industries that make steel.
Meaning steel tariffs probably hurt more jobs than they helped.
That was the implication, a likely net job loss. And there was broad agreement among economists back then that the steel and aluminum tariffs wouldn't actually improve Americans' overall welfare.
What about the idea of using tariffs to fix the trade deficit?
They cautioned that approach would likely just shrink both imports and exports, not necessarily fix the balance.
And crucially, who paid the tariffs on Chinese goods?
The evidence was pretty clear. The costs were largely passed through to U.S. importers as higher prices.
Not paid by China.
Not primarily, no. And those higher import prices often got passed on to consumers. They saw it in things like washing machine prices going up. The IMF also modeled significant economic losses for both the U.S. and China from the tariff escalation.
So the idea that China just absorbs the cost, the data doesn't really back that up.
The data strongly suggests U.S. consumers bore the brunt through higher prices. Some businesses absorbed some costs, sure, cutting into margins, but largely it flowed through.
Did it help manufacturing jobs overall?
The Tax Foundation analysis actually found a net decrease in manufacturing employment. Any gains in the protected industries were more than offset by losses elsewhere due to higher input costs and, importantly, retaliation from other countries.
Retaliation hurting exports.
Exactly. They calculated the 2018-19 tariffs were effectively like a 2% tax on all U.S. exports. And agriculture took a huge hit, direct export losses estimated at $27 billion just in those 2 years from retaliation.
And has that pattern continued? The pass-through of costs?
Seems so. Evidence from just last year, 2023, showed the tariffs on steel, aluminum, and Chinese goods were still almost completely showing up as higher U.S. prices.
So the burden remains largely domestic.
That's what the data indicates. Production might go up in a protected sector, but it often goes down in sectors that use those protected goods because their costs rise.
Did the earlier tariffs succeed in boosting the economy in the U.S. heartland, as was sometimes hoped?
The analysis suggests no, they didn't really provide that economic help. And agriculture, as we said, actually saw negative employment impacts because of the retaliatory tariffs.
Okay, we've got the economic data, the projections, but what about the opinions, the different perspectives on this whole trade conflict?
Well, going back a bit, Lu Shang from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences back in 2019 sounded pretty pessimistic about talks, calling Trump unpredictable.
And there were reports of censorship inside China.
Yeah, suggestions that domestic reporting on the trade war was being tightly controlled.
From the U.S. side, what were some other viewpoints?
You had analysts like James Andrew Lewis at CSIS stressing that China needs to play by international trade rules, emphasizing reciprocity.
Makes sense.
Harry Broadman, a former U.S. trade negotiator, he agreed China had unfair practices, but he really disagreed with the unilateral tariff approach. He argued for building a coalition with allies.
A different strategy.
Yeah. Chad Bown at the Peterson Institute noted other countries were also ready to confront China, but he questioned if the Trump administration was truly focused on the deep systemic issues versus just the trade balance.
There were also concerns about relying on China for certain goods, right? Especially during the pandemic.
Absolutely. Concerns were definitely raised about tariffs on medical supplies, given China is such a major global supplier. That highlighted the vulnerabilities in supply chains.
And public opinion in the U.S. is their support for these new tariffs.
It seems divided. A Harvard Cap Sheriff's poll from January this year showed 52% approval for new tariffs on China, but with a big partisan split. Much higher support among Republicans than Democrats.
And were there critical voices within China about their own economic direction.
Yes, interestingly, the economist Sheng Hong was quite critical of China's state capitalism model. He argued it was actually hurting China's own economy and wasn't compatible with real market reforms.
What happened to him?
His think tank was shut down. He faced accusations related to state security, which really highlights how sensitive those kinds of economic debates are within China.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, what are the absolute key takeaways for someone trying to understand where U.S.-China trade stands right now?
Well, first, this ongoing disagreement about who even initiated the latest contact, it just underscores how complex and, frankly, maybe fragile the relationship is. It's full of mistrust.
And the tariffs.
The huge ramp-up in U.S. tariffs in 2025, based on the economic analyses we've looked at, is projected to bring significant economic pain. Higher costs for American consumers, a drag on U.S. growth, and potential ripple effects globally.
So for you, listening to this, understanding these dynamics, the conflicting narratives, the economic projections, it's really crucial context for making sense of the current economic and political climate.
Definitely. And the fact that the stories from the U.S. and China are so different, it really drives home the need to look critically at information from all sides.
Which leaves us with a final thought, something for you to mull over.
Given these projected major economic impacts from the tariffs and the very different views on whether they're necessary or effective, what other long-term strategies could possibly lead to more sustainable, maybe even mutually beneficial economic engagement between the U.S. and China? What might that look like?